I was supposed to be free in 10 days until the ink dried on my release, and the Vane estate became a ghost of my past. Instead, I'm staring at a positive pregnancy test while the man who owns my soul smiles from the shadows of the doorway. You aren't going anywhere, Alessia, Killian whispered, his tattooed hand possessively covering my womb as he stepped into the light. I made sure of it. Alessia has spent 3 grueling years scrubbing bloodstains from cold marble floors and perfecting the art of being invisible to avoid the piercing, predatory gaze of Killian Vane. To the world, she is the ghost of the estate, but to herself, she is a survivor with a secret countdown to freedom. Killian is a man defined by absolute control. His sharp, custom-tailored suits and the intricate black ink tattoos crawling up his neck mask a dangerous instinct that never misses a detail. He hasn't just been watching her, he has been growing obsessed with the quiet defiance in her eyes. On the very eve of her planned departure, he strikes with a calculated cruelty, turning Alessia's own body into her newest prison. As he basks in the victory of his manipulation, believing he has finally chained her to his side forever, he fails to see the cold fire igniting in her expression. Killian thinks he has trapped a victim, but he has actually just invited his greatest saboteur into his bed. The heavy silence of the Vane estate was a familiar companion to Alessia as she moved through the dim corridors, a shadow among shadows. For 3 years, her life had been measured in the rhythmic stroke of a brush against cold marble and the quiet clatter of silver being polished to a mirror shine. To anyone else, the sprawling mansion was a display of obscene wealth and power, but to Alessia, it was a fortress where every bloodstain she scrubbed away whispered a story of the ruthless man who owned it. She had mastered the art of the ghost, eyes downcast, breath held, and heart steeled against the suffocating presence of Killian Vane. Her survival depended on her invisibility. Killian was a predator who thrived on control, his authority etched into the sharp lines of his custom suits and the dark ink that spiraled up his neck like a warning. Every time he walked into a room, the air seemed to vanish, replaced by a tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. Alessia had learned to navigate that tension, always staying just out of reach, a silent servant who saw everything and said nothing. She was the keeper of his secrets, the one who cleaned the messes the world wasn't supposed to see, all while harboring a secret of her own. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the small, Spartan room she called her own was a battered notebook. It wasn't filled with poems or dreams, but with a series of slashes, a countdown that was her only lifeline. Each mark represented a day of her debt paid, a day closer to the moment she could walk out of the iron gates and never look back. 10 days. That was all that remained of the 3-year sentence her father's gambling debts had forced upon her. She could almost taste the salt air of the coast she planned to flee to, a place where the name Vane carried no weight and no one would ever know the ghost she had become. But as she worked, she felt the familiar, prickling heat of a gaze on the back of her neck. She didn't have to look up to know Killian was there, watching her with that unnerving, quiet intensity. He had been lingering more lately, his presence a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Alessia gripped her cloth tighter, her knuckles white, and focused on the countdown in her head. She just needed 10 more days of silence. She didn't realize that while she was counting the days until her freedom, Killian had already decided she would never have it. The bathroom of the Vane estate felt like a cold, porcelain tomb. Alessia gripped the edge of the marble sink so hard her knuckles turned a bloodless white, her breath hitching in her chest. On the counter lay the plastic stick, its 2 vivid pink lines screaming a truth that shattered her world into jagged, irreparable pieces. The silence of the mansion, which had once been her cloak of invisibility, now felt like a suffocating weight. She had played the game perfectly for 3 years, scrubbing away the evidence of Killian's violence while meticulously carving out her own path to freedom. She was a ghost with a countdown, a woman 10 days away from vanishing into a life of her own making. Now, that countdown had stalled at 0. A crushing wave of realization washed over her, heavier than the guilt of her father's debts. This wasn't just a failure of her plans, it was the ultimate trap. Her mind raced through the months, calculating every missed pill, every accidental lapse that she had brushed off as stress. It wasn't stress. It was sabotage. Every careful step she had taken toward the iron gates had been mirrored by Killian's silent, predatory movements in the shadows. He hadn't just been watching her, he had been weaving a biological web to ensure she could never truly leave his side. The air in the small room grew thin as the weight of her new reality settled in. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was a vessel for the Vane legacy, bound to a man who saw her as a possession to be secured rather than a person to be freed. The exit strategy she had nurtured with such desperation, the secret notebook, the hidden cash, the quiet resolve, was now nothing more than a ghost of a dream. Killian had known her heart was set on leaving, and he had used the one thing she couldn't outrun to anchor her to his world of blood and marble. A shadow flickered across the crack of the door, and the familiar, terrifying scent of expensive cologne and iron filled the hallway. Alessia didn't need to look up to know that the predator was closing in to claim his prize. The two pink lines weren't just a sign of life, they were the bars of a golden cage that Killian had built specifically for her. Her hands shook as she swept the test into a drawer, her mind already shifting from the grief of her lost freedom to the cold, hard necessity of a new kind of survival. He thought he had won, but he had forgotten one thing. A mother with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy of all. The transition from the Spartan, familiar shadows of the servant quarters to the oppressive luxury of Killian's master suite felt less like a promotion and more like a slow walk to the gallows. Alessia stood in the center of the sprawling room, her small suitcase, containing nothing but the battered notebook and a few threadbare clothes, looking pathetically out of place against the silk rugs and polished mahogany. The scent of Killian's expensive cologne and iron was everywhere here, a sensory reminder that she was no longer a ghost in his hallways, but a permanent fixture of his private world. Killian moved with the silent, predatory grace that had always terrified her, his sharp suit discarded to reveal the dark ink spiraling up his neck and across his chest. He didn't speak as he closed the double oak doors, the heavy thud of the latch sounding like the final turn of a key in a lock. When he turned to her, his gaze wasn't on her face, but lower, settled possessively on her abdomen where his heir, her new prison, lay hidden. "The staff has been informed," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to command the very air in the room. "You are no longer the girl who scrubs the floors, Alessia. You are the mother of the next Vane dawn. Every guard on this estate now answers to your safety, and every exit is barred to anyone but me." He stepped closer, his tattooed hand reaching out to tilt her chin up, forcing her to meet his dark, obsessive eyes. The touch was almost tender, a terrifying contrast to the cold calculation of his betrayal. "I told you that you weren't leaving," he whispered, a smirk ghosting his lips. "I don't lose what belongs to me." Alessia didn't pull away. She remained as still as the marble statues she used to dust, her expression a mask of submissive shock. But beneath the surface, the fire he had ignited with his confession was hardening into something lethal. She looked around the suite, noting the private terminal on the mahogany desk and the heavy safe tucked into the corner. Killian thought he had brought his prize home to admire. He didn't realize he had just granted his most motivated enemy access to the heartbeat of his empire. As he pulled her toward the massive bed, Alessia let her eyes drop, hiding the cold, sharp calculation that was already beginning to dismantle his world, piece by piece. Killian left for his business meetings with the arrogant stride of a man who believed his fortress was impenetrable because he had finally chained its most elusive ghost. He had kissed my forehead with a terrifying possessiveness before departing, murmuring that I should rest and grow strong for our child. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut and his footsteps faded down the marble corridor, I didn't succumb to the exhaustion he expected. Instead, I sat up in the silk-sheeted expanse of his bed, my eyes landing instantly on the sleek mahogany desk in the corner. The digital terminal sat there, a silent sentinel of the Vane Empire's secrets. Killian viewed me as a delicate vessel, a broken bird he had successfully caged, and in that overconfidence lay his greatest vulnerability. He hadn't bothered to lock the terminal or shield his screen during the few hours we'd shared in this room. To him, I was just a maid with a fourth-grade education and a belly full of his legacy. He was wrong. He didn't know about the nights I'd spent in the library of my father's old estate before the debts took everything, or the way I had carefully observed every passcode he tapped into his phone over the last 3 years. I slid out of bed, my feet silent on the plush rugs, and sat at the desk. With steady fingers, I entered the sequence I had memorized from the shadows of his office months ago. The screen flared to life, illuminating the cold, hard resolve in my reflection. I didn't look for jewelry or cash, I looked for leverage. Within minutes, I was scrolling through encrypted ledgers, shipment schedules, and the private correspondence that kept the Vane name feared across the underworld. Every file I opened was a crack in his armor. I found the digital trail of the accidental lapses in my birth control shipments, proof of the calculated cruelty he had whispered about in the shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained still. He thought he had trapped me with a child, but he had actually handed me the map to his destruction. I began to mentally categorize the data, which rival families would pay the most for these routes, and which federal agencies would bleed for these names. Killian Vane wanted me to be his queen in a golden cage. He didn't realize that from the center of his own master suite, I was already beginning to burn his kingdom to the ground. The stillness of the master suite was shattered not by Killian's return, but by the sudden, sharp percussion of gunfire echoing from the grand foyer below. I froze at the desk, my heart colliding with my ribs as the screams of the household staff pierced the heavy oak doors. Killian's enemies, vultures who had been circling the Vane Empire for years, had finally found a weakness. They didn't want his ledgers or his territory. They wanted the pregnant maid he had so publicly claimed, the one leverage point that could bring the ruthless Dawn to his knees. The door to the suite groaned under a heavy impact, the wood splintering as the lock began to give. In that moment, the ghost I had been for 3 years vanished, replaced by a primal, protective coldness. I didn't hide under the silk sheets or cower in the walk-in closet. Instead, I reached for the heavy, obsidian paperweight on the desk, a solid piece of volcanic rock that Killian used to pin down his death warrants. The door burst open and a man I didn't recognize, clad in tactical gear and smelling of cheap tobacco, stumbled in, his weapon raised. He expected a weeping girl. He found a predator. Before he could level his gun, I lunged, swinging the obsidian with a desperate, focused strength. The impact against his temple was sickeningly solid, and he crumpled to the floor without a sound. I didn't hesitate. I pried the handgun from his twitching fingers, the cold metal feeling like a natural extension of my resolve. When Killian finally kicked the door open minutes later, his face a mask of frantic, uncharacteristic terror, he stopped dead. The room was a wreck, and I was standing over the unconscious intruder, the pistol leveled steadily at the doorway. Blood from a small cut on my cheek dripped onto the white silk of my collar, but my hand didn't shake. "I told you I was a survivor, Killian," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as the marble floors I used to scrub. I lowered the gun only when I saw the sheer, stunned realization in his eyes. He had spent months trying to turn me into a captive bird, but in his obsession, he had ignored the claws I had been sharpening in the dark. He came to save a victim. He found the woman who was going to take his throne. The aftermath of the attack left the air in the master suite tasting of ozone and copper. Killian knelt by the fireplace, his usually impeccable black suit jacket discarded, revealing the intricate tattoos that crawled up his neck like dark vines. He wasn't looking at the chaos or the unconscious intruder. He was staring into the dancing flames, his expression uncharacteristically hollow. "My mother was a ghost in this house, much like you tried to be," he began, his voice a low rasp that barely carried across the silk rugs. He didn't turn to look at Alessia as she stood by the desk, the weight of the stolen pistol still grounding her. She thought she could hide in the shadows of my father's cruelty, thinking if she made no sound, she would never be broken. But in this world, silence isn't a shield, it's an invitation. He finally turned, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For the first time, the predatory mask had slipped, revealing a raw, jagged edge of trauma. When she finally tried to run, she didn't even make it to the gates. I watched him take her freedom, and then her life, because she had nothing to tie him to her, no leverage, no reason for him to see her as anything more than a replaceable fixture. Killian stood, crossing the room until he was inches from her, the scent of his expensive cologne now mixed with the bitter smoke of the fireplace. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, trembling slightly before he smoothed a stray hair away from her cut cheek. "I didn't trap you to destroy you, Alessia. I trapped you because I couldn't watch another ghost vanish. I made sure you were mine forever because, in my world, the only way to protect something is to own it so completely that no one else dares to touch it." For a heartbeat, the vulnerability in his gaze nearly swayed her. The sincerity of his twisted protection felt like a warm hearth in a cold storm. But as his hand moved down to rest possessively over her womb, the memory of his sabotage, the calculated theft of her autonomy, flared back to life. He wasn't protecting her, he was protecting his prize. Her resolve, momentarily softened by his confession, hardened into a diamond-sharp edge once more. The moment Killian placed his hand over her womb, Alessia knew the time for passive observation was over. While he spoke of twisted protection and the legacy of ghosts, she saw only the blueprint of his destruction. She waited until the deep, rhythmic breathing of his sleep filled the master suite before slipping from the silk sheets once more. The cool air of the room felt like a splash of cold water, sharpening her focus as she bypassed the primary terminal to reach for the burner phone she had intercepted during the chaos of the previous day's attack. Her fingers danced over the screen with a precision that would have terrified Killian had he been awake to see it. She didn't reach out to the authorities. In this world, they were merely another arm of the Vane influence. Instead, she contacted the Moretti family, Killian's most ruthless rivals, using a secure, encrypted channel she had discovered in his private files. The message was simple but devastating: the precise coordinates of Killian's offshore accounts and the upcoming schedule for his most sensitive smuggling routes. Each sent message felt like a physical strike against the cage he had built around her. She wasn't just leaking data, she was surgically removing the pillars of his power. By weakening his financial and territorial grip, she was ensuring he would be too preoccupied with the survival of his empire to maintain his suffocating hold on her. She watched the delivered status blink on the screen, a silent vow that the freedom he had stolen would be reclaimed through the very legacy he sought to protect. As she tucked the phone back into its hiding place and returned to the bed, she felt the slight flutter of the life growing inside her, a reminder of the stakes. Killian thought he had secured his future by trapping her, but Alessia had just turned his greatest secrets into the currency of her escape. The great sabotage had begun, and by dawn, the Vane Empire would be fighting for its life, unaware that the architect of its downfall was sleeping right beside its dawn. The roar of the explosion from the front gates vibrated through the floorboards of the master suite, nearly knocking Alessia off her feet. Smoke began to curl beneath the heavy oak doors, and the air hummed with the chaotic staccato of automatic gunfire. Killian's empire was under siege from the very rivals Alessia had fed with his most guarded secrets. Killian burst into the room, his white shirt stained with soot and a frantic, unhinged look in his eyes that she had never seen before. He didn't reach for his weapon, he reached for her, pulling her into the reinforced walk-in closet with a strength born of pure desperation. "They shouldn't have been able to find this route," Killian hissed, his tattooed hand trembling as he keyed in the lockdown sequence for the suite. "Someone sold me out. Someone handed them the keys to my throat." He turned to Alessia, his eyes searching hers for the familiar comfort of his ghost. But what he found instead was the burner phone she had forgotten to conceal in her rush. The small, glowing screen lay on the silk duvet, still showing the confirmation of the data leaked to the Moretti family. The silence that followed was more deafening than the gunfire outside. Killian's face transformed from panic to a devastating, cold clarity. He looked at the phone, then at the woman he had meticulously trapped, and finally at the swelling of her stomach, the heir he had sabotaged her life to secure. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The woman he thought he had broken was the architect of his ruin. "You," he whispered, the word dripping with a mixture of agony and awe. "You didn't just survive me, Alessia. You dismantled me while I slept beside you." As the doors to the suite finally groaned under the assault of the Moretti enforcers, Alessia stood tall, the stolen pistol leveled at the entrance. She didn't look at Killian with fear, but with the cold authority of a woman who had already won. Killian realized in that moment that his father had been wrong. Ownership wasn't protection, and a prisoner with a mind for vengeance was the most dangerous threat in his world. The raid wasn't just his ending, it was her transformation. The smoke from the heavy artillery fire outside began to seep into the master suite, mixing with the scent of Killian's expensive cologne to create a suffocating perfume of ruin. Killian didn't move from where he stood, his gaze still fixed on the burner phone, the physical evidence of his own destruction. The sounds of his empire being systematically dismantled echoed through the halls, but the most profound shift was happening right in front of him. Alessia didn't look like a prisoner anymore. She stood with the weight of the stolen pistol grounding her, her eyes reflecting the cold fire of a woman who had finally found her leverage. "The Moretti enforcers will be at that door in minutes," Alessia said, her voice steady and devoid of the submissive tremor she had practiced for 3 years. "They don't just want your territory, Killian. They want the head of the man who thought he was untouchable. And they will take it, unless you give me a reason to stop them." Killian finally looked up, his dark eyes searching hers for a shred of the ghost he had once believed he owned. He saw only a strategist. He realized then that his attempt to secure her through biological manipulation had backfired with poetic precision. By trying to tie her to his world forever, he had forced her to master it. "A partnership," Killian rasped, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "A partnership on my terms," Alessia corrected. "I have the codes to the offshore accounts, the names of every informant you've ever paid, and the ears of the men currently burning your front gate. You can keep your title, Killian, but the power belongs to me. You will never bar another exit to me, and you will never again mistake my silence for weakness." Killian looked at his tattooed hands, then back at the woman who had just become the most dangerous person in his life. The predator recognized another predator. He didn't have a choice. He could lose everything and die a legacy of one, or he could accept the new order. He lowered his head, not in defeat, but in a grim, newfound respect. "The keys to the kingdom were always yours, Alessia," he whispered. "I was just too arrogant to see it." Alessia turned back to the door as the first Moretti enforcer kicked it open. She didn't hide. She raised the weapon, not to protect a husband, but to secure her own reign. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had completely inverted. Killian stayed because he was hers now, and Alessia stayed because she was finally free to rule.